Okay. So, the most important thing, which I feel I've said a lot of times, but I'm going to say again, about level 1 exams is that all of us, the examiners, the trainers, everyone, desperately want you all to pass, and I have no doubt that any of you won't pass. You will definitely all pass. They are absolutely going to be encouraging and positive and helpful, and not put you on the spot and leave you there to sort of feel like, oh my god, I wish the ground would just open up in front of me and swallow me up if you can't find the answer to a question. So, for example, I think you're guaranteed to get a question about Suzuki philosophy. You're all really strong on talking about Suzuki philosophy. I think the things where some people sometimes get themselves a bit like rabbit in the headlights are something like, could you tell me which pieces in book 1 you would work on for staccato? And sometimes people sort of feel like, oh my god, suddenly all of the pieces in book 1 have gone out of my head. And if that did happen, they would say something like, which of the twinkle variations is working on staccato? Like, they're going to feed you information so that you are feeling supported and helped and encouraged, and not just be like, oh my god, she can't even remember what staccato is, let alone all the pieces. So I don't want any of you to worry about sort of like failing the Viva. It's just not going to happen. Failing any of it is not going to happen. But you know, it's very much a sort of, obviously it feels intimidating because it's an exam, but it's much more like a chat than it is a kind of you know, oral examination. So would you be more worried, Freya, about... So I think you're likely to have 3 or 4 questions. The talking bit is about 10 minutes. It's very short, 10 to 15 max. It's the time allowed for level 1 exam is 45 minutes. And so that is, roughly speaking, 15 minutes of teaching. It takes about 12 minutes to play your pieces. So normally you play first, then you teach, then you do the Viva. So it's likely to be, you know, 15 to 20 minutes, sorry, not 10 to 15, 15 to 20 minutes max of talking. And it's very likely that you would get an extremely broad philosophical question like, could you describe Suzuki philosophy to me? Do you want to practice?
Yes. So, the Suzuki philosophy was started by a man called Shinichi Suzuki in the 1950s. And basically it was like a reaction to the war that was going on at the time, and a kind of almost like a safe space for children.
Or had been going on recently. Yeah.
Yeah, that had been going on recently. Yeah, so this kind of like safe space for children, and it's based on this philosophy that, with the main motto that every child can.
And what does that mean, every child can do what?
So every child can play an instrument, can learn violin, and it's like a possibility. It's, you know, like no child's going to walk through the door and you're going to be like, they just can't do it. So it's that kind of like openness and things like that. And then there's a really important part within the philosophy of the Suzuki triangle. So making sure that the student, the teacher, and the parent or the adult at home are like included. And that just means that we'll have like one-to-one lessons and group lessons. But also there'll be this element of like the home teacher at home, which is the adult at home, kind of encouraging practice. And then another really important thing is the whole idea of listening, and listening to the repertoire every day, and just making sure that that kind of oral awareness is going in, so that feeds into the lessons.
Great. And can you tell me why is the listening so important?
I think because in terms of, say if the students have book 1, it kind of, if they listen to the whole book, which they should be doing every day, like it kind of gives like a more like rounded idea of like where they're going to progress to, and like the kind of the bigger idea, because the whole thing about Suzuki as well is it's like a long term like commitment, so it's not just violin or something. So that's really important. And I think the whole idea of Suzuki, like, just listening to something like it really aids your playing, like more than anybody can necessarily realise, and it's kind of linked back to the whole like mother tongue approach of.
That's what I was hoping you would say.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
It's
that's okay.
wild, so, yeah, and how, you know, kids like learn a language and learning music can be the same as that.
Great.
Yeah.
Kit, could you add a little bit more about Suzuki philosophy that you don't feel Freya's touched on very much yet?
The individual group lesson.
Yeah, could do. There's not really philosophy though, is it? That sort of practice. So to summarise what I've heard from you, you've talked about how every child can, which is excellent. You definitely need to say that in your exam. Just put it in there, even if you don't think that's what they're asking for. Just make sure you say those words, and that they can learn to be talented would be a good. Like that's what you're really looking for. Learn to be talented. And Dr. Suzuki's, his research institute was called the Talent Education Research Institute. It still is. So it's about talent education. She's talked about how learning by ear and the parent-teacher-student triangle. So can you give us another kind of strand of the philosophy? So if this happened in the exam and you were kind of like looking like you're trying to find the words or find the thing that we might be trying to get to, probably what would happen is one of the examiners would say something like, could you describe to us what the kind of feeling in the lessons and in the practice is supposed to be in Suzuki? Like what kind of relationship are you trying to foster between you as a teacher and your students, and also between the parent and the students?
Like them feeling comfortable and enjoying the lesson and wanting to come and all that.
Exactly, and how does that relate to the philosophy? Like can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Like a loving environment and a safe environment and like feeling that they can ask any question that's not stupid and all that.
Excellent. Good. Positivity, I think, is another word that's really positivity and encouragement are two that you want to kind of stick in there if you can. So I think that would be helpful. But that's exactly like if you get a question where you're just like, oh my god, I don't know what they're asking me, they will kind of tease it out of you a bit like we just did. And that's exactly the right thing. You said exactly the right things. You want to, you want your students to be motivated to keep coming. You want them to enjoy what they're doing. You want them to enjoy the process of learning. A lifelong love of learning is another very good phrase. It's not about the results, it's about the process and the experience. And environment is key, isn't it, in developing that. Very good. So they might say something like, Bex, how do you think having a fixed repertoire helps in the Suzuki method? Why is it useful?
Well, the way the pieces have been put into the book, it's very much, it doesn't go in a sort of a straight line of sort of every piece is like really challenging all the time. It takes a much more sort of, some pieces are more challenging than other pieces, so that the rate of progression sort of varies throughout the repertoire.
And why do you think that's good?
It helps people to progress faster because every piece isn't always a huge challenge. You get some pieces that are a huge challenge and then other pieces that are quicker to move through. So it's good for motivation to have some pieces that are challenging and others that you get through quickly, so that the speed of getting through the pieces isn't always the same. It varies.
Good. And how does that? How does having a fixed repertoire help them learn their new pieces?
Well, having a fixed repertoire, it means that the repertoire's all on the CD, so you listen to the repertoire, you're able to do the repertoire in groups and things, they're able to do the repertoire together. Whereas if people were sort of learning random pieces, they wouldn't be able to come together in groups and learn the repertoire together or listen to the repertoire in the same way.
Great. And what is the key idea that Suzuki sort of taught us about having a fixed repertoire, meaning that what's the thing that you teach your students that's different from other methods?
So review's really important. So the whole thing of Suzuki, it's the mother tongue approach to learning a musical instrument. So just as every child can learn to speak their mother tongue, every child can learn to play a musical instrument. And just as you sort of gain new vocabulary, you don't sort of lose the vocabulary that you started off with. You add it to your ever-growing list of vocabulary. So that's the same as with pieces. You add to your repertoire and you keep the old pieces in review.
Great.
And all of those pieces, they're sort of structured in such a way that you're building on your technical skills. So when you go back and you review a piece, you're reviewing technical skills that are relevant to your current pieces.
Perfect. Exactly right. Good. So there'll be something like that, something about Suzuki philosophy, about how it works in practical terms, like what is useful about this, or how do you, maybe how could you help a parent develop a positive environment at home? How can you help a parent to commit to a daily routine of practice and listening? How does having a group lesson and a private lesson help motivate different types of children? Who do you think, sometimes might get a slightly off-centre question, like who do you think benefits the most from having multi-level group classes, for example, like if you're teaching books 1 and 2 in one group class, who's going to benefit from that? And of course the most is maybe I shouldn't have said the most, but who benefits from that? So then you could talk about, what would you talk about if I say why is it having a mixed level group lesson? What could be the benefits of having a mixed level?
One
group
aspect of the group 1 people can look up to the group 2 people to see where they're gonna be, but then also the group 2 people can also look at the book 1 people to kind of think just the whole idea about review and what they can go back to and feeding in their techniques now into the kind of simpler repertoire.
Excellent. Yeah, and that it's inherently it increases their self-confidence, doesn't it? To see, that's what I've come from, but it also helps them to get better at what they're doing at the moment, to be practicing their old pieces alongside the kids for whom those pieces are their newest pieces. Yeah. Or you might, so you'll get something like that about environment, method. About banjo. Banjo. Stop it.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I like that. That's a main jump of it too.
About what to do with small scrappy dogs. Right, so you will get a question about something like that. Stay there. You will probably get a question based on what they've seen in your teaching. So, for example, if they're not happy with your 4th finger intonation in Minuet 2 when you play, they might say to you, could you teach perpetual motion in the exam? And they'll just sort of notice whether your 4s are in tune when you demonstrate. And if you pick something else, you're not expected to mind read what they want you to work on. But for example, if you had a student play perpetual motion who had poor tone and you worked on tone, if you don't know what to work on tone. Like if you see a student, you're not going to have a perfect student who just makes you panicked to teach them, but that is the kind of basic, if you don't know what to work on, posture, tone or intonation are your absolute go-tos. And you know, and then if you do know what to work on, because the teaching point of the piece, for example, they come playing Song of the Wind and it's, not crisp staccato, then obviously you would do that and that's fine. So then they might say something like, Kit, could you chart the development of the fourth finger through book 1? Where would you introduce a fourth finger for the first time, do you think?
Perpetuation.
Excellent. And then where do you really need to have really excellent and accurate fours?
Well, all the other places that I use fours.
Yes, but where do you think the big test for the fourth finger might be? There are several right answers. If you're not sure which one, doesn't matter.
Well, minuets just sound good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. Freya, which other pieces might you say?
I think maybe etude, because it's quite similar to perpetual motion, like the continuous quavers.
Good. Yeah, but more complicated.
Like
Yeah. Could also say Bex.
Gossett Gavot is the main challenge for the fourth.
Loads of fours. Yeah. Or Allegretto and Andantino. Yeah. So there are lots of different answers to things like that. And I'm aware that we haven't traced the use of the fourth finger particularly. I don't think, but that would be what we would say. It's if they said, where do you introduce fours and how would you develop the use of the fourth finger, you would basically say, we introduce it in perpetual motion for the first time, and then you use it on the D string in Allegretto, and then you're kind of mixing up fours and opens in Andantino.
I'll
And
just
then,
try to explain a bit, like doing two more.
and then etude, you have some fours, and the minuets, you have some fours, but then the next big challenge is in Gossett, and that would be like a gold star answer. Okay.
In the teaching.
Yeah.
So we're getting given a random student, aren't we? So we're not going to know who it is.
I will introduce you to the students, I think, the week before.
Oh, okay.
So the thing for me is that they have to be at least on sort of the minuet stroke Happy Farmer. I've just got to have a little think about who would be the best. I think I've probably got to ask Atlas and Tundra, because Tundra's in the middle of book 2, so she can review all of her book 1s easily, and then Atlas is at the beginning of book 4, so he can do the level 2s. But it won't be Cielo or Angelo or someone who's only just started. Which I think, to be honest, I think it would be useful for level 1 if they asked you to teach a pre-twinkler.
No, I think that's harder.
Because it's harder than, once you know that they can play, to teach Angelo, well, and even he can do his fingers now, but to teach someone like Riker who's really in the middle of just starting it all, but a student who's not as angelic as
I was
Riker.
going to say.
That's much more difficult.
Yeah.
And but anyway, so that's why I have you have been teaching, Cielo and Angelo some of the time.
But is it likely that the examiners are going to tell us what to do in the lesson, or is it more likely that they'll Atlas will walk in and we'll just do the lesson and
I think
I take
the
initiative?
examiners will say, could you play perpetual motion?
Okay.
Could you work on perpetual motion?
Okay.
And then you'll say, okay, let's warm up with a twinkle. Always warm up with a twinkle. Definitely start the lesson with a bow. Check the tuning. Involve the child in the tuning, even if it just does that sound good. And then do a twinkle that's connected to whichever piece they've asked you to do, and then it'll be 10-15 minutes of a lesson. And if you want to work on posture, you don't even need to play the piece, you know. I don't think that they would say, I don't know what they would say if they saw a child, but you're not going to have a child with really poor posture, so. But if you wanted to work on posture, you know, you could say, playing a little bit of perpetual motion. Well, what I'd like to work on is helping you with your violin position, and even if they didn't play any more of perpetual motion after that, if you did all the right things in the lesson, the feedback would still be like, yeah, great, you did the right thing, not like you didn't work on perpetual motion. Any other questions?
So can you work on the piece itself? Like if there are bits that they're struggling with in the piece, can you help them with that?
I would recommend that you don't, because that's not really displaying the skills that you want to display. Like what you want to do is think about teaching to the priority, what's the most important thing for that child. If that child's playing, you know, nicely and can't remember a bit, for example, if you get I don't think they would ask you to teach etude because it's so frequently remembered poorly. For example, if they ask you to play, could you play minuet 1, and the child can't remember when it goes, or whether it goes, for example, if they mix it up with minuet 2, which quite often happens, I think it would be a much more successful lesson for you to be like, okay, that's lovely, let's work on ringing sounds in G major and take it back to other pieces. Twinkle in G, just do the first line of minuet, rather than to be like, oh, okay, the problem is you don't know how that bit goes, let me teach it to you, because then you're just teaching fingers and notes.
Okay.
So I would, if there's a teaching point of the piece that you can work on, do that. If the posture is not great or the bow hold is not great, do that. If you can work on tone or intonation, do that.
It's always teaching point first, if you can figure out.
No, the biggest problem first. So probably you won't have a student who has a big problem. But for example, you may have a student who's like bumped their shoulder that day in school, and so they come and they're putting their violin in a weird place, and you might realise during the lesson that that's why that's happened, but that would mean that yes, you're supposed to work on posture. So the idea is that you work on the most important thing for that child, and then in the hierarchy of what's most important, tone and intonation are the big two on one side, and posture is equally important on the other side. So if posture and tone and intonation are fine, then you can work on the teaching point. But even if the teaching point is, like, even if they're playing perpetual motion legato, if the posture isn't right, you would ignore that and say, I would like to help you with your posture today. Does that make sense? So in terms of what's most important, tone and intonation, posture, then teaching points, then general musicality like phrasing, dynamics. Okay?
I think so, yes.
Kit, any questions?
I don't think so.
Great. Bex, any questions?
I think that was it.
I think what would be really helpful for all of you is to practice your 3-minute, you know this thing about an elevator pitch, like if you're starting a business you should have a 3-minute just off pat discussion of what it is, so that if you met a multimillionaire in a lift you could get them to give you money. So I think it would be really helpful for you to just practice what is Suzuki philosophy, just go over your what is Suzuki philosophy essay, just practice getting in the mother tongue approach and how that relates to what we actually do in terms of learning by ear, delayed reading start, help from parents, those things. Environment, helping your students' families create the right environment, motivation, growth mindset, and just kind of get your like 3-minute version of what Suzuki philosophy is, so that you're really confident on that, because I'd be amazed if you don't get that question or something similar in the exam. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And just practice saying, to your mates in the pub, like, can I just practice telling you my 3-minute thing about what Suzuki philosophy is? Yes, you can. Okay, great. And then they'll also be like, so what about, or yeah, that sounds great, or whatever.
Cool.
Cool. Good. Well done, team.
It's going to be excellent.
So please come back at 2:15.